Recording in progress. Here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this year's installment of the Global Digital Governance webinar series of the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation at Columbia Business School. I'm Bill Drake. I'm the Director of International Studies at CITI. Normally, we start with an introduction by Ellie Noem, who's the founding director of CITI and has been here 40 years, but Ellie's out of town. So I'm just going to jump right in, and Ellie will join us next time we meet. This is a series on global digital governance, the international rules of the game set by states and stakeholders for digital information and communication technologies. This is the first meeting of the academic year. The last academic year, we had meetings on a variety of topics like the ITU and internet governance, internet fragmentation, the Internet Governance Forum, ICANN, the UNESCO Social Media Guidelines, the UN Digital Cooperation Forum proposal, and so on. There have been a lot of interesting developments on all those since then, as you probably know. Videos and transcripts of previous sessions of the series are on our website, that listed on the announcement for today, as well as on the ISOC Live website. And this year we'll be continuing the conversation with sessions on things like the UN Cybercrime Treaty, the WTO digital trade negotiations, and various other things too. October, we're not going to have a meeting because I'm traveling, but our next meeting will be Wednesday, November 15th. So to get then to today's topic, there have been longstanding debates about the importance and need for institutional innovation in global digital governance as new issues arise. There's always demands expressed in the global policy marketplace for new governance mechanisms to tackle these issues, but often not much effective supply of governance solutions due to differences among states and stakeholders and the volatility of the issues, and so on. So existing intergovernmental organizations and regimes often struggle to expand their mandate and get buy-in on new issues, and new organizations and regimes are often hard to stand up for the same kinds of political reasons. Somebody needs to mute their mic. But anyway, the problems of adaptation that I'm talking about have been especially acute to the trade domain, as we've seen both domestic and international politics have made cutting broad and strong multilateral deals on digital trade and related issues harder and harder. And even the US government, which historically has been a driving force of those kinds of agreements, has been sort of backing off on them and opting for more flexible kinds of arrangements like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. So when something new happens that seems to be working, or at least seems to have promise, it's worth taking note of that. And that's why we're talking today about digital economy agreements and digital partnerships. Digital economy agreements are new approaches to international cooperation and policy convergence that have emerged alongside and been informed by digital trade negotiations. The center of gravity on these has been in the Asia-Pacific region, with Singapore being very centrally involved. The most widely discussed example of a DEA, a digital economy agreement, is the 2020 Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, or DEPA, between Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand, which Korea has just joined. So those 4 member countries, and Canada and China are in the process of trying to join. This is the most significant and foundational of the digital economy agreement, so we'll probably talk a lot about it here today. But there have been other intergovernmental pairings as well, including the 2020 Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement, the 2022 UK-Singapore DEA, the 2023 Korea-Singapore Digital Partnership Agreement. And now you may know that the 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations has launched negotiations of an ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement, which could constitute another and broader variant of this. All of these agreements have addressed multiple issues in the digital economy, promoting policy convergence on many topics that have been addressed to varying degrees in free trade agreements, but addressing them in a way that's without the traditional apparatus of trade treaties. So you've got language on issues like cross-border data flows, forced data localization, online customs duties, treatment of digital products, business and trade facilitation, invoicing certificates, source code, and so on. But also a lot of other kinds of issues are being addressed as well. Non-discrimination and market access has not been as central to some of these things. Discussions of supply chains, digital identities, digital inclusion, consumer protection, fintech, artificial intelligence, regulatory sandboxes, efforts to support small and medium-sized firms. There's a lot of language covered by these agreements that are sort of go beyond the kind of traditional kinds of focus of trade agreements. And in parallel, the European Union has launched a series of what it calls digital partnerships. We have the Japan-EU digital partnership, the EU-Korea digital partnership, and the EU-Singapore partnership, all agreed in 2022, with more anticipated. Unlike DEAs, these are legally non-binding agreements and generally more programmatic than rules-focused, but they share some, and they cover many different issues, like DEAs, but they share a somewhat similar architecture, having multiple tracks of activity that move at different rates and in different ways under an umbrella framework. And the digital partnerships also explicitly call for regular multi-stakeholder dialogue and input, which I think is an important dimension that you'd like to see built out more, and coordination of positions in other international forums. So, but the most notable shared feature of the DEAs and the digital partnerships, and the thing that we want to talk about here today, is the notion of their modular architecture. This is, to me, fairly interesting. Modularity is not an entirely new construct. There are other international institutions that have used formulas with elements that can be characterized as modular, but in the DEAs and the DPs, it's explicitly a foundational kind of feature. Modularity can mean different things to different people, but here we're talking about an architecture that treats different issue sets differently as discrete components under an integrative umbrella framework. The Brussels doesn't use the term modular in its digital partnerships. It talks about a range of modalities, but I mean, basically it's the same kind of construct. And what this allows then is the mixing and matching of different types of efforts on the part of governments and stakeholders. You can have variable commitments, hard and soft agreements, depending on the maturity of the issue and how well developed consensus is. You can address issues at variable speeds and depths and have kind of different levels of agreement on different issues. You can institutionalize different kinds of patterns of cooperation for different issues using joint mechanisms like working groups or putting things under a broad oversight council. This makes the whole framework kind of more adaptable and agile, and a living agreement that can be updated as issues arise, and allows potentially and explicitly, in the case of digital partnerships, for stakeholder participation, and avoids a lot of the kind of negotiation dynamics that are characteristic of traditional trade deals, where you have a kind of all or nothing trade package. Here you can have different levels of agreement on different issues in a more disaggregated way that allows issues to be progressed. And you can even have potentially, I suppose, layered membership architectures and so on. So modular approaches, I think, are quite interesting if you're going to try to address a broad range of digital governance issues between different groupings of countries. And so I thought it'd be useful to have a session talk about this. And in fact, we're going to do, the people who are speaking today, a session related to this on digital economy agreements and internet fragmentation at the Internet Governance Forum, the UN meeting in Kyoto in a couple of weeks, and where we'll be joined by a couple of other speakers as well to talk about fragmentation aspects. So it's an important set of issues, and I'm very happy to have to talk about it a leading panel of leading group of analysts who've been involved in these issues. Stephanie Honey is joining us from New Zealand. Stephanie wasn't included in the event announcement because I wrongly assumed she wouldn't want to get up and give a talk at 3 a.m. in the morning in New Zealand, but I'm glad she's joining us. So Stephanie, welcome. She's a trade policy consultant and previously worked for the government of New Zealand as a WTO trade negotiator, was much involved in the DEPA, the digital economy, the agreement that I mentioned, which is kind of foundational to all this. She's currently a lead staffer for New Zealand members of the APEC Business Advisory Council and a trade policy advisor to the New Zealand Asia Institute at the University of Auckland. So she's joining us from New Zealand. Again, welcome. Neha Mishra is assistant professor at Geneva Graduate Institute She was previously a lecturer at the Australian National University College of Law and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. She joins us from Switzerland. Also in Switzerland is Richard Sammons. Rick is the director of the International Labor Organization's Research Department and has been a Sherpa to the G20, G7, and BRICS processes. Previously, he was a founder and chairman of the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, a managing director of the World Economic Forum, and director general of the Global Green Growth Institute, among other things. Has a long back, also served in the Clinton administration in the White House, and he's joining us from Switzerland. And finally, Marta Soprano is a fellow in international political economy at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and she has extensive experience working with international organizations on digital trade issues, and she's joining us from the UK. So, nice panel. We'll do 4 or 5 rounds, tour de table, talking about some different questions, and then we'll open it up, as always, to open discussion with the people who are in attendance here at the top of the hour. So that's the game plan, and I'm looking forward to a vibrant conversation. So, okay, so let's get started. So let's start, first of all, with just the basics, because I think a lot of the people who attend these sessions are more telecom and internet governance kind of background people than trade people. So not everybody's going to be familiar with digital economy agreements and how they work and so on. So let's just start with basics of what are we talking about here? The who, what, why, how, what are digital economy agreements? What's been agreed to date? How important in general have they been? And so on. And any thoughts on the digital partnerships of the EU as well, also useful. So who can I ask to start? Stephanie, who can I ask to start? Background at that.
Thank you, Bill. I think that's my cue. So in a nutshell, these are a new kind of agreement, digital first, dedicated digital economy agreements that have really come out of a process, a sort of an evolutionary process in the Asia Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, over the last sort of 10 years or so. And they are agreements that essentially try to set a series of rules, but also really importantly, a kind of creating a platform for conversation about regulatory coherence essentially in the digital economy. And so these agreements are not a classical FTA. They don't include market access commitments, for example, but they have a range of different elements, modules, as you rightly commented in your introduction, which address different aspects of digital trade, ranging from things like trade facilitation, so paperless trade and e-invoicing and so on, through to elements around digital trust, so things like digital identities, privacy and data protection, but also seeking to enhance innovation and participation in the digital economy. So notably, these new style agreements also include provisions on things like artificial intelligence, data innovation, data sharing, but also inclusion for small businesses, other groups in trade that have not traditionally been significant participants. So, for instance, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that you mentioned among New Zealand, Chile, and Singapore, and recently Korea, includes a provision on digital inclusion that specifically mentions the participation of women, Indigenous communities, and so on. Let me leave it there and give a chance for my panelist colleagues to chip in as well.
Great, thank you. Who would like to join? Marta, you've done work on DEPA. You have any thoughts that you can share?
Yes.
Again, just basically outlining for people what fundamentally are these frameworks about.
Yes. Yeah, I think that it's important, as Stephanie mentioned, when we talk about these agreements, we're really, and especially the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, we're really talking about a completely different type of free trade agreement or preferential trade agreement that we have discussed before. Never before, DEPA is actually the first international trade agreement that is completely dedicated to trade in the digital economy, and it doesn't address trade in the traditional WTO dichotomy of services and goods. It kind of like looks at it from a more holistic kind of approach. And as Stephanie mentioned, there are some of the issues that are addressed in these agreements that are completely different or very forward-looking with respect to anything that has been covered before. So in a way, sort of DIPA in particular, we can see it as some sort of like a watershed. It was the negotiations were launched in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, completed in June of 2020, and we can already see this as a completely new type of agreement that was only dedicated to digital trade, and therefore even the way it was negotiated, the fact that it involved 3 countries that have similar characteristics, which is Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, that are relatively small countries that look very much to maintaining an open economy and free trade and benefiting from free trade, that already says a lot about, in a way, sort of the spirit behind the negotiation of this agreement. And there is a lot. I mean, we'll go on and on about discussing the sort of what will come after, but in a way, sort of in the history of and in the context of the WTO in particular, this agreement kind of like is completely different from anything that we have seen before.
Well, that's the important point, and that's why we want to talk about them today. So that's very helpful. Thank you. The fact that you had fairly comparable members involved, I think, is a key consideration here when we think about this as a model and how much it generalizes. Who else would like to get in on this first round? Rick? Yeah, sure. Go for it.
Yeah, let me make a slightly broader point, step back a little bit, and that is that these agreements or these negotiations are significant from an international system standpoint in the following sense. Up to this point, almost exclusively, trade negotiations have been focused on market access of one sort or another. And at the same time, capital has flowed much more extensively over the last couple of decades or so that has been pushing countries to coordinate areas of regulation that heretofore were mainly considered domestic in nature, within the purview of national or domestic authorities. Now, this is not the first such area where we've begun to see a big agenda for regulatory cooperation and coordination. But this one started out several years ago as in a more traditional way within the trade framework, which I'm sure, Bill, you could elaborate on, as basically looking at market access dimensions, highly influenced by some of the chief corporate actors or first movers in the space, who, in the traditional way trade policy is organized in many countries, tried to, were setting the agenda to focus in particular on market access priorities. However, as was the case with investment, international investment, which started in a similar way and hit some major bumps in the road 10, 20 years ago in the international trade system, there are major domestic, social, and other considerations that need to be brought to bear. And the international investment regimes have been playing catch up for many years in this regard. We're now in a kind of a phase where we're internationally, we're developing new types of international investment agreements, whether they be bilateral or plurilateral, which seek to strike a better balance between these types of social considerations on the one hand, and the traditional offensive market access, export promotion priorities that are the traditional bread and butter of trade policy. I personally see this development, I don't know whether I'd call it a proliferation yet, but this ongoing development of a variety of different approaches toward developing digital economy agreements as a welcome move to try to short circuit the earlier problems that the investment, for example, had in the trade regime. That's the great promise of them. I know we'll get into a little bit more detail going forward. I think there's still a long way to go to strike that balance, but I'll leave it there. Back to you.
That's really helpful, Rick. And I think you're right. That's that because trade is proven so difficult in contemporary context for so many of these issues, this is providing another way of trying to get at some of these things. Neha, did you want to get on this too?
I also want to emphasize that the thrust, when we think of trade agreements, we are also often thinking of disputes and or going before trade tribunals. But the thrust of these agreements is not dispute settlement at all. And as Stephanie and Marta emphasize, it's more about building platforms for interoperability, for regulatory cooperation. And even though it is a trade agreement like DIPA or Australia Digital Economy Agreement actually replaces the e-commerce chapter in their FTA, but a lot of provisions in these DEAs are actually soft law. They are not binding. And in that sense, generally when you think of trade agreements, you think of binding rules, but they are just soft provisions which allow for different forms of cooperation. And in that sense, if you compare them with the EU partnerships, the EU-Japan or EU-Singapore or EU-Korea, and if you compare the provision, the thrust is quite similar. It's on trust building, it's on building interoperability. So yes, I know we have these different terminologies and we don't know how to exactly club them. But if you look at the thrust, then it's actually the digital economy agreements can be considered to be a very broad range of instruments and not just very traditional trade-like instruments.
Mm-hmm. This aspect that you've talked about of the use of soft law and kind of normative objectives and things like that is obviously one of the things that makes these things a bit easier for states to work with. At the same time, of course, some in the private sector raise concerns that they don't think that's providing enough, meaningful market liberalization and so on. So that's one of the points we might want to get into. It's a trust building and evolutionary kind of approach. Well, why don't we try to zero in a little bit more on this modular aspect, because I think that's what's really aside from the fact, the use of soft law, the modular structure is what I think is kind of interesting, because it really does provide states with a little bit more of a flexible kind of menu of options for how they're going to cooperate with each other and where they want to bind themselves to stronger convergence of policies or harmonization, where they want to have more establish an ongoing work program to elaborate trust in joint projects, etc. So it's kind of an interesting approach. So my question, I guess, is can we talk a little bit more about what's interesting or unique about doing things in a modular way? Can the modular models be scaled, evolved to do other things? For example, the EU has in its partnerships explicitly said that we're going to use these things as ways of bringing in stakeholder participation, which historically you did not have baked into trade agreements. The notion that there'd be ongoing engagement of people from the private sector, civil society, and so on, and the EU is trying to do that. One could do that with DEAs too. So my question is really the modular aspect. How is it unique? What could be done with it? Stephanie, go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. If I could jump in first on this one. I think it's important to draw a bit of a distinction between the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement that we talked about earlier and the rest. So essentially the landscape is you've got DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which is very deliberately framed as an open plurilateral agreement. So there's an accession mechanism. Other countries can essentially join the DEPA or can take some or all of the modules of the DEPA and use them. But then separately, there are bilateral or sort of closed set agreements, if you like. So those digital partnerships that the EU has with a number of Indo-Pacific economies, but also some Singapore-led bilateral digital economy agreements, DEAs. So for instance, between Singapore and Australia, Singapore and Korea, and most recently Singapore, or relatively recently Singapore and the United Kingdom as well. So taking it outside of this sort of Indo-Pacific region. But the significance of making that distinction between the bilateral instruments and the DEPA is because the DEPA in particular has been designed as essentially a tool to generate greater global coherence in digital economy regulation or digital trade regulation. So as I said, it's an open agreement that others can join. And fundamentally, the authors of the agreement had this goal at the beginning of trying to influence global norms. So as Marta pointed out, initially was three small open economies. Why do they need to do an agreement? There aren't, sort of major regulatory frictions that need to be addressed between those three. But I think it was driven by a desire to see greater coherence, because fundamentally digital trade is global. A small business in an economy doesn't think I'm going to, try to market my digital services or my digital products into a particular country. They are looking at the global marketplace, and that's made more complex if there's regulatory heterogeneity, if the rules are different in different economies. And so what the three authors of the DEPA started out by saying is, how can we as small participants in the global trading system create a greater, more seamless digital economy? And so the DEPA is essentially a tool to do that. So either countries can join the DEPA, and that would generate a more seamless, free trade zone, if you like, for digital products or digital trade, or it can have influence on the way other countries design their own trade rules by plucking out these modules that you mentioned. So the DEPA has 16 different modules that cover sort of thematic issues. So for example, business trust, or innovation, or inclusion, or data governance. And so other countries could simply choose to use the model, if you like, the model agreement on paperless trade, let's say, or personal information protection, use that in their own agreements. And I think the authors very deliberately set out to create essentially a sort of a gold standard model on particular aspects of digital economy regulation that could influence global norms. And, I think very deliberately also feed into this process that's going on in Geneva to negotiate a new set of digital rules under WTO auspices as well.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So the transferability of the modules and their possible replication, and the fact that other countries can join the open framework for DEPA, these are all really, I think, important aspects. Who else would like to jump on this, on modularity? Marta, yeah, please.
Yeah, I think that one other aspect that we should consider about this idea of modularity and this new way to look at it is the fact that each of these modules, in a way, is kind of like self-contained. They address like a set of like specific issues within each of the modules, but in a way, like they're under these, there's coherence between the different modules. But as Stephanie pointed out, you can actually take some of these modules, and not all of them, and just replicate it and use them as templates for your domestic policy, or use them as templates for other bilateral free trade agreements that you want to sign. What is interesting, though, within also this modular setting is that you can actually advance. On some level, you can discuss issues that have been included time and time again in previous chapters on electronic commerce or digital trade. I mean, paperless trade is actually the first provision to ever appear in an international trade agreement, in a bilateral trade agreement. And I think it was between New Zealand and Singapore in the early 2000s. So some of the issues related to data. So some of the modules, for example, related to data issues, cover kind of like foundational and more core issues that we have been discussing time and time again in the past couple of decades whenever we discuss e-commerce. And so maybe in these cases, these modules, you can actually have maybe language that is even a little bit less best endeavor and a little bit more binding, that has a little bit more bite to it. At the same time, one of the reasons, for example, why DEPA was such an interesting new type of approach to the regulation of digital trade is that you can have modules on very new issues, where you can just have these modules. So in the case of emerging technologies, DIPA was the first agreement to ever include a provision on artificial intelligence. Before everyone started really talking so much about AI as we're doing today because of ChatGPT and everyone kind of like getting a little bit scared about generative AI and general purpose AI. So I think that this modular approach probably allows you to address kind of like long-standing issue and maybe go deeper in these sort of issues. But at the same time, it allows you to maybe put forward and, you know, some of potentially new issues that haven't been discussed so much before, but that may be the future of digital trade regulation, and therefore should be sort of at least put to the attention and to the table. And as Naya mentioned before, some of them have really best endeavor language, in particular those related to emerging technologies, because probably we're still not, you know, the countries that kind of like negotiated this maybe did not feel that they could negotiate something that was more binding at the time because it was still very new. So I think that this is one of the potential advantages of this modular sort of approach.
Right. So for new issues where the circumstances are not right to try to cut a strong binding agreement, you essentially institutionalize a process of ongoing collaboration that will hopefully over time build up and lead to greater convergence of policy. Whereas for other issues, you can go further. So modular allows that multi-speed, multi-format kind of approach. Either of you other two like to join on this point, or yeah, go ahead. Just go ahead, Nia.
Okay. So I'll just add a brief point to Marta's point. So usually, I think when we think of such international agreements, we think also of international law. But the way I look at these digital economy agreements, DIPA, and a lot of follow-up agreements as well, is they kind of generate these transnational legal orders, which take into account that there are multiple stakeholders. It's not just government to government. There are multiple stakeholders involved in this process. So I remember you mentioned at the beginning something about stakeholder engagement, and a lot of digital economy agreements, including the DIPA, have a provision on stakeholder engagement, which is that from time to time we'll have these deliberations around digital economy and we will involve different stakeholders. And I think this is the natural outcome of a modular process, because of course there are certain modules for which maybe if there's a module on non-discrimination, governments may not necessarily consult many stakeholders. But if it's a module on an emerging technology or on data innovation, then a lot of other stakeholders could be involved. So it kind of creates that flexibility, which I think is a added advantage to this format.
Absolutely. And you know, I mean, coming for those of us who've been involved in multi-stakeholder processes and internet governance and so on, one of the frustrations is always when you deal with the trade world, that the trade people say, oh, you can't have stakeholders involved. We're negotiating mutual concessions to each other. It's too sensitive. If you let stakeholders be there at the table, you'll never be able to agree to give up bananas for the other guy's cotton or whatever. And here you have a mechanism that says, okay, we're going to work on some of the same issues, but we have the possibility of drawing stakeholders in. And that can include new kinds of stakeholders that are often not involved, like civil society, labor, other kinds of players who can't be directly engaged in trade processes. So,
and some of them also mention the academia some of these digital economy agreements also mention the role of academia in certain aspects, especially development of new technologies. So I think that's quite critical as well.
anytime academics are given a space, that's obviously the key thing in the world.
Could I jump back in there, because I you know, fully endorse what Nia has said, and you as well, Bill, that I mean, I think this is a novel quality of these new style agreements as well, and actually really reflects the nature of digital trade itself, because I think in a lot of cases we're all sort of building the plane as we're flying it. You know, a lot of these, particularly in the more sort of frontier technology areas, these are new areas of sort of technology and trade with new implications for the sort of economic impacts, the legal implications, the sort of rights and civil society sort of impacts as well. And I think, you know, the fact that this stakeholder engagement is sort of baked into a lot of these DEAs, and particularly the DEPA, really reflects the fact that nobody has a monopoly on the knowledge and the understanding of what these new kind of technologies actually mean. And in fact, often, for instance, business or big tech or small startups and innovative firms have a much more nuanced understanding about what is needed to enable or what barriers are in these areas. I was engaged by the New Zealand government to moderate the first SME dialogue, so small and medium enterprise dialogue under the DEPA, which focused on the fintech sector. And that was actually a really interesting exercise, because I would say that, you know, there's a very long tradition of cooperation and engagement on trade between New Zealand, Singapore and Chile, the founder members of DEPA, going right back actually to the early days of the TPP agreement, or CPTPP as it's now called, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, where, you know, those three countries actually started the ball rolling for the TPP as well. That began as an agreement between those three countries and then grew into the TPP. And I think the DEPA parties saw this process as a similar one, where eventually, you know, it will be a sort of a snowball effect building into a much bigger agreement. But despite that tradition of knowledge and familiarity among those three economies, when we got to do the DEPA SME dialogue, which focused on the fintech sector, it was so interesting that there was actually not a hugely strong relationship among the fintech sectors, the regulators, the negotiators in that area. And so it was actually an incredibly valuable process of thickening the relationships and deepening the ties and understanding the nuances of how fintech works between those three countries and globally. So I think, you know, the stakeholder engagement is a critical element of these DEAs, because it not only helps policymakers to understand the priorities, the concerns, the implications of what they're doing, but it gives the business community a chance to really leverage these agreements to generate more business, and presumably also in the civil society dimension, it gives a chance for some of the sort of unforeseen consequences of some of these new technologies to be given greater visibility, and a chance for policymakers to respond to that in a more formalized way as well. So really, I think quite an innovative aspect that reflects, as Rick pointed out earlier, the really very sort of cross-cutting nature of the digital economy that touches not just on, you know, trade, quote unquote, but a much broader dimension of sort of civil society, rights, life, economics, labor issues, inclusion in the economy, and so on.
Well, drawing in the stakeholders not only strengthens the discussion in terms of qualitative character of it, but also maybe it helps to avoid some of the political problems that happen later. I mean, you look at what happened with TPP and so on. So many trade agreements, you know, after the fact, once the, you know, trade negotiators come out of the room with the smoke signals and say, here's what we did, and labor and other civil society groups all stand up and say, hey, we don't want this. So from that standpoint, Rick, do you think these kind of frameworks could be useful in drawing labor into a better, more formative discussion around digital governance issues?
Yeah, potentially, but it all boils down to what what the operating mode is of the negotiating team of the governments in this regard. You know, if their inclination is basically to do things without all sorts of ex ante consultation, then they may well do that in this case as well. What I'd like to do is just take this modularity discussion, really good one, into an additional direction a little bit here. And that is that it's not, modularity is not just a useful device for dealing with new issues that people are, you know, sort of getting to a better understanding of, like the implications of blockchain or AI or generative AI, et cetera. You also see modularity, or what I might call variable geometry, within the existing agreements, the early agreements, across different provisions of them. Some of, even on bread and butter issues, like basically e-commerce facilitation, I might call them, aspects. Some of these areas are treated essentially as principles. They're leaving a lot of space to national authorities to figure out exactly what they're going to do to implement it, as opposed to having really binding, minimum, consistent, and comparable rules. That's another sort of aspect of modularity, if you will. And I want to connect this to the larger systemic, you know, international trade system aspect of this. And that is that, so you've got, you know, different tiers of obligations or commitments in some of these agreements along the lines that I've suggested in others. And that connects to how the whole architecture is going to evolve in the succeeding years and decades in the following sense. Different countries have different sensitivities about, in particular, how they're going to apply the ample exceptions that exist in a number of these agreements. Those exceptions basically relate to what I was talking about just a moment ago, is basically these are kind of national commitments to embed principles, agreed principles, into domestic regulation. But there's no specific, in many cases, template for exactly what that national regulatory framework ought to look like. That connects with different levels of appetite for international comparability and consistency. And, you know, let me take the sort of one of the most pronounced examples of this. You know, China has applied to become a member of some of these, right? But it has a very different conception of what the regime should be for cross-border data flows and other considerations than many other countries, including the pioneers that signed up to DEPA. And so I think we're going to see modularity or variable geometry across different agreements out there. And again, let me connect this to the WTO discussions. There's 70 some odd countries involved in this joint statement initiative. And you can imagine the more multilateral, the more broadly plurilateral, if you will, the membership of an undertaking like this will be, the more you're going to have a least common denominator that's going to lean probably more towards these types of principles. It's principles-based approach, if I could call it that, as opposed to very hard and fast rules of regulatory implementation on the other. Now, I want to close on this by bringing it back to the stakeholder issue, is that, yes, I think we're going to see probably tiers of ambition of different types of agreements. And the ones that are more principles-based are going to create that much more of a need for stakeholder engagement in that crucial phase of turning the principle into a national regulatory framework, right? That creates both the need and I think the scope, frankly, for much more engagement, as opposed to a bunch of trade negotiators getting in a room and from the top down deciding chapter and verse, black letter law, exactly what the rules of the road are going to be. So it is a very textured landscape that's developing, which connects to the topic of this round of discussion, modularity, but it goes beyond just this kind of layering on new topics.
Right. And indeed, the point you make about China, I think, is an important one, because when you look at trade negotiations in the WTO, for example, and you try to think, how do you get hard commitments that the Chinese are going to accept on data flows, data localization, those kinds of issues, that will also be acceptable to the U.S. and the American business community, et cetera. It's pretty hard to see how that works. If you've got a modular kind of approach, the DEA, you can bring them into the tent and try and build towards more convergence over time. Whether that happens, whether that's commercially meaningful is another question, but it's interesting option for this. Let's just talk a little bit other in terms of the issues that are covered. These things are all multi-issue. They cover lots of different everything from 5G and 6G to, as you say, artificial intelligence and so on. Any thoughts on what have been the key issues that maybe have been progressed by taking this kind of approach relative to other kinds of frameworks like traditional trade agreements? Have we seen that DEAs or even DPAs, DPs allow further movement or better levels of agreement in principle to try to work towards something on some key issues than other kinds of agreements? Where have we seen real progress that's interesting or important? Any of the issues in particular? Anybody have any thought on that? I'm just curious. Nobody?
Well, let me kick us off
yeah.
again on that. Look, I think it's a very interesting question, and I think there's such a broad range of topics that's covered by these agreements, and in fact, we've seen in this relatively short lifespan of this new style of agreement, which has really only been, as Marta said, since the DEPA, which was the first of these, kicked off in 2020, there has actually been a growing suite of issues that they've captured. But in terms of sort of concrete successes, I think it's relatively early days. Probably the area where we've seen the greatest sort of most binding and substantive rules, hard law, if you like, has been in the digital trade facilitation area. So things like paperless trade or e-invoicing, particularly in the bilateral agreements or partnerships, there has been quite a lot of movement to really build out in that area, put in binding rules, run pilots. So, for example, between Australia and Singapore, they have a very detailed work program on paperless trade and a number of other areas like digital identities that have really tried to put some flesh on the bones of, as Rick says, what's otherwise sort of more of a principled approach or a kind of broad framework approach. But in some of the more innovative areas like AI or data innovation or, the sort of more frontier technologies, I guess you could say, really what's happened so far has just been creating this platform for a conversation rather than putting in place hard law. But that's really, to use a kind of a digital metaphor there, it's a feature, not a bug, because as a number of others have commented, in this area, nobody really knows what is the perfect, regulation in this space, because the technology itself is so new and is also evolving that, it's a process of sort of learning as we go along. So I do think that, it's interesting to see this expanding universe of topics that are covered. Probably we'll need to see in a few years' time whether it can actually generate binding law. But also there are a number of aspects that, despite the agility of this new model that is bringing in things like AI and some of the hard infrastructure like submarine cables and so on as well, it's not even rapid enough to keep up with, I think, some of the new kinds of technologies that we're seeing emerging. So, for example, quantum or, there are more things on the horizon that even these agreements have not foreseen. But particularly in the case of DEPA, it is actually intended to be a living agreement, which is another novelty, unlike the sort of more traditional FTA, that very deliberately it's designed to be able to add in new modules to reflect emerging technologies or emerging concerns, presumably as well. If, you know, one could foresee not just on the new technologies, but new concerns, for instance, around misinformation or other dimensions of cybersecurity, for example, where, you know, we may see emerging issues that the parties consider need to be regulated in some sort of cross-border sense that could be added into these agreements as well.
Right. The platforming of these issues is really a key aspect for the standpoint of long-term view in terms of the institutionalization of governance mechanisms in the effort to build cooperation on some of these diverse issues, rather than jumping directly to trying to get short-term agreements that are binding and so on. Any other thoughts just on, yeah, Marta, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a comment on sort of the fact that there are several new issues that have been included in this agreement. I think that it is always important to remind ourselves when sort of these agreements and in what context these agreements emerged. And that is with the fact that we don't have currently multilateral trade rules that are specifically dedicated to trade in the 21st century, so digital trade. We do have some rules that apply that were negotiated 20, 30 years ago, that were negotiated possibly to and could cover a certain aspect of digital trade. But multilaterally speaking, we do not have currently a multilateral agreement on digital trade. And one of the reasons why we started seeing these type of agreements is because more and more countries realize that because of, you know, the crisis in multilateral negotiations, and have seen sort of also the difficulties of negotiating these rules at plurilateral level, we kind of like, it was necessary to discuss them in a way, sort of these were the alternative to at least discuss some of these issues to keep up with what was happening on the ground. I think that one of the constant battles that we face in digital trade, and we were talking about, you know, law before, is the fact that these technologies progress at a pace that is in any way much faster than regulation can be. And I think that probably these agreements sort of should be viewed also with that, with the idea that, okay, we don't have multilateral rules. We need to start kind of like thinking about everything that we need to cover and could be relevant to trade in this digital trade in the 21st century. And therefore, it could be that some of these issues, some of these modules are more sort of a way of, let's at least think that this could be some of the issues that we may need to face much more in the future. And I think that it was, in my opinion, it was also interesting to see that they had like you know, they included in DEPA in particular, they included a module on emerging technologies, but at the same time, they had a module on small and medium enterprises, which I think is very important. There is a tendency to think about digital trade and technologies as something that is somehow driven and only relates to big multinationals. But the reality is trade on the ground is the vast majority of companies that trade internationally are actually small and medium enterprises. So I think that having like an entire module dedicated to that and in a way kind of like pinpointing that out, I think it's very significant. Again, in the broader context of what international trade relations are and what international trade law is.
I think you're absolutely right about that. We're getting closer to the top of the hour, at which point I'd like to open it up to everybody who's here to join in the conversation. Let me just ask as a sort of last quick round, put it into a broader kind of context. And number one, looking forward, if we were to have this meeting 5 years on this topic 5 years from now, what would your expectation be about the extent to which this kind of approach has grown, taken root, become more significant, and also just more generally, I mean, how do we think about, if somebody comes to you skeptically and says, why do these things matter? What would we be able to tell them, do you think, in 5 years? Anybody have a crystal ball kind of sensibility about where how this fits into the or could fit into the larger evolution of international order around digital issues? Maybe somebody who hasn't spoken recently, for example.
I mean, I could give you a shot at this. I mean, you know, multilateralism is just getting more and more difficult, you know, as a general matter, as I think we've already identified in this discussion. And thus, in the trade space, as in others, the variable geometry, the plurilateral, modular types of approaches are in the ascendant. And so I don't have a crystal ball on this, but I would certainly expect that because of that general secular trend in international relations, that we're likely to see this approach be taken up more widely, more creatively, creating more and more texture, you know, and variability in the trade architecture. Now that's on a state-to-state basis. Let me use this occasion just to also talk about an interdisciplinary basis. You know, I'm here with the ILO, and I can tell you that there are digital services issues, digital trade and services issues that have a very strong implication for labor regulation. And it's a question whether should not there be some modules, so to speak, that deal with the way countries treat gig workers, for example, on digital labor platforms, in various aspects of their rights. There are universal rights or core labor standards in this regard that are observed to a greater or lesser degree by countries around the world. There are issues around the application of algorithmic tools that surveil workers, that are used in performance evaluation, that are sometimes used in recruitment and selection procedures that have, you know, inherent potential for bias. And so issues about transparency, human in the loop considerations, this topic of digital trade and services goes well beyond the bread and butter trade e-commerce facilitation stuff that the field was built upon, and that is now moving into other frontier technologies. And so I think that this is another dimension by which the crystal ball may suggest that we're going to see a proliferation or sort of a broadening of this approach.
I totally agree with everything you just said, Rick. I think looking forward to broad multilateral frameworks are going to end up being more the floor, but then on top of that, you have to have more textured, variable kinds of approaches for different clusters. The risk, of course, that trade people always raise is if you get a proliferation of different agreements with different parties, with different rules, you end up with this kind of spaghetti bowl of frameworks that the private sector doesn't know how to operate across borders and so on. That's always one of the big issues with this kind of approach. But it seems that the evolution is toward a much more varied kind of model. Other folks want to jump in on this last kind of perspective? Yeah, Stephanie.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think the point that you and Rick have just made is a really critical one. If we're looking at, you know, what are the 5-year implications or 10-year implications for business and civil society? I mean, the fact is that we are seeing this sort of regulatory overdrive, to use the phrase that the Global Trade Alert, Digital Trade Alert, Simon Evernet and friends have used. I mean, we are seeing a huge amount of new regulatory action in this space by governments. So like it or not, you know, regulators are taking action on this. And in the digital economy, you know, there really isn't any such thing as sort of a national digital economy. You know, it's fundamentally has a sort of cross-border impact because of the agile nature of digital trade and digital services trade in particular. And so, you know, I think one thing that we are likely to see is this ongoing sort of pressure for greater fragmentation of the digital economy, and actions that governments might take, which may not even necessarily be aimed at trade, could have the effect of essentially curtailing others' abilities to trade, or adding cost and sort of red tape to cross-border activity as well. So I think there's a really compelling case to keep pursuing regulatory coherence, or, you know, trying to reduce the frictions across borders in this space. And you know, mechanisms like the DEAs or DEPA are an important way of trying to address that. But one of my concerns is that we have the DEPA, which is a kind of a mechanism for cross-border interoperability in an open sense, but then we're also starting to see a lot more of these bilateral agreements that are very similar and mostly very ambitious, but do have nuances that from a business perspective in particular actually will end up adding costs. I mean, there are some very important shared sort of outcomes-based principles, but equally the way individual countries might be regulating could still create heterogeneity that's a sort of a cost or a friction or a headache or a challenge, particularly for small businesses. And the sad thing about that is one of the incredible things that the digital economy promises is this potent inclusion potential. So small businesses can essentially leapfrog some of the structural impediments that have made it hard to trade through digital technologies or digital trade. Developing economies could potentially do the same, but the more friction that we build in through regulation, the less those groups or countries are going to be able to participate. And I think one of the really significant challenges that we face in the next few years is going to be, well, I mean, it's fine if you're New Zealand or the United States or Canada or you know, Europe, you're probably going to be able to operate in the global economy. But if you're a developing country, a lot of these countries don't even have some of the most basic regulatory building blocks for the digital economy in place, or are, you know, really a long way behind some of the developed countries in that space. And that is putting their businesses at quite a significant disadvantage to engage in what should be this amazing economic growth opportunity of the digital economy. So I think, you know, the 5-year vision is going to be ongoing pressures for fragmentation and the sort of the spaghetti bowl, as you say, but also this real challenge around inclusion that needs to be addressed to, I guess, you know, sort of bolster broader economic growth. Because the other thing that we haven't really touched on is digital is not just a small, you know, specialized segment anymore. It is integral to everything in economic activity and trade, and increasingly so. So it's not just a kind of a niche interest, it's something that actually impacts on all economic activity.
Totally agree. In fact, that's what I argue in my classes in school. All right, we've gotten past the top of the hour, so maybe I'll see if anybody wants to jump in. But I just want to flag, in particular, the point Stephanie made about developing countries, the global South, and its role in this whole environment is something that I think really does merit much more concerted discussion, and it's something that I think probably we should do a session on in this series as well, because I think we don't give it enough attention. But let's just try and see if there's some folks in the room who'd like to join into the conversation, have any questions, thoughts, comments, bones to pick, issues to throw on the table, and so on. Welcome any and all. We're a multi-track modular event here, so we welcome all forms of engagement. Anybody? While people are cogitating, let me just maybe pursue this last point a little bit more than the prospects for growth. I mean, the people who were involved in doing DEPA, and Stephanie, you were one of them, had the idea that you could essentially start to build out this kind of approach to promote more open multilateral agreement, that by getting more parties to sign on, et cetera, et cetera. But then we see the contradictory point about the spaghetti bowl impact. What happens if the rules are highly variable across countries? So one of the things I'm just wondering about, if you look at who's been party to this so far, With the DEAs, it's been mostly countries in the Asia Pacific. Canada's seeking to join, but we haven't seen, for example, the United States moving to get involved in this. There have been think tanks in Washington who've said the US should be doing these kinds of things, but seen no movement so far. Do we see over long term that maybe developing countries that have not been engaged in other regions, or industrialized countries too, might start to get on board these kinds of frameworks, that this framework could, this kind of approach could grow into by agglomeration into something that provides more international order? Anybody have a thought on possibility of others getting on board this stuff?
Well, I know Nia has written some fantastic pieces on this, but maybe I'll just kick things off if you like. I mean, I think we are seeing some quite interesting engagement in the Asia Pacific from developing economies. I mean, obviously, some of them are party to the region's DEAs or DEPA, but we've also seen, particularly in Southeast Asia, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is a very active participant in digital economy rulemaking. ASEAN itself has had a very sort of lively program of work on this, and has recently agreed that it's going to negotiate a digital economy framework agreement that you mentioned in your introduction, Bill, that builds on an e-commerce agreement that they concluded quite a few years ago now, but has only relatively recently been implemented. But it includes a lot of DEPA or DEA-like aspects, much less fleshed out even than what's in the DEPA, but you know, at least gives a nod to the importance of this holistic approach, the kind of broad agenda of digital economy issues. And I guess we can anticipate that the DEFA will build on that with a you know, a kind of a Southeast Asian flavor to it, reflecting the processes that have been going on there. But then we also have this interesting new model that the United States is promoting. As you mentioned, Bill, they're not in any of the DEAs as such, but IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, actually has a digital component in its trade pillar, which, you know, obviously no you know, white smoke yet on that being concluded. But as I understand it, it includes a lot of, let's say, DEPA-like or DEA-like elements, the sort of more modern iteration of a set of digital rules or kind of understandings or platforms for a conversation. And it includes some quite interesting countries, a lot of those Southeast Asian sort of allies of the United States, or countries of interest to the United States, but also, you know, rather surprisingly, Fiji is a member of that. And, you know, there's, I think one of the big challenges on the development front is how to support the engagement of Pacific Island countries in the digital economy. That's something that Australia and New Zealand have been quite focused on. Probably not very prominent in your part of the world, but, you know, there are these areas, geographies, if you like, whether it's in the Pacific or developing Asia or Africa, where there really is, you know, a big sort of development and engagement challenge. And I think it'll be interesting to see how we can bring those countries into this conversation. One interesting aspect of the Singapore-Australia DEA is that it actually has a provision on regional capacity building for engagement in digital trade, which I think is something very creditable that, you know, other countries should be thinking about as well, because it's very clear that even, you know, wealthy developed economies struggle to engage meaningfully in this and understand the multi-dimensions of these issues. And, you know, there's a really important sort of job of work that needs to be done to build the capacity of developing countries to engage. Let me leave it there.
I think the ASEAN thing is a potentially really important example. If you get 10 countries with that market size starting to follow something comparable to this model, I think that could really add juice to it. But still, it's very much Asia seems to be, Asia Pacific seems to be the focal point of a lot of this activity. And I wonder, if you couldn't see it, if this model would be applicable, it might be taken up on the other side of the planet, or in the north-south basis and so on. These are questions I think merit some consideration going forward. Neha, Stephanie mentioned that you'd done some work on these kinds of issues. Do you want to add anything on this point, or?
So just one thing I'm very conscious about is when we talk about developing countries, we're actually talking about a large variety of countries, because there's a lot of variation among developing countries. And the ASEAN is a great example, because even though it is still very Asia-centric, but it is a collection of countries which are at very different stages of development. There are least developed economies, and there are extremely wealthy economies like Singapore in the same association. But I think they also have a long history of being very pragmatic and incrementally building upon things. So the whole e-commerce agenda is actually very old in ASEAN. They have gradually built upon it and over several years, and now they have reached a point where they think they're in a position to negotiate a digital economy framework agreement. But if I look at developing countries as a whole, and by that I also mean developing countries in South Asia, in Africa, in South America, there is perhaps some skepticism as well, because a lot of countries are conscious about signing treaties where they think they will lose some of their autonomy, because the feeling is that if we sign these agreements, then we lose the ability to protect our domestic sector or to promote our digital sector. I think the incentives are not necessarily properly aligned yet, and that's partly because not many developing countries have participated in these digital economy agreements. So I think if the way forward to getting more developing digital economies to participate is to have the right kind of provisions. And that would mean that you might need to go into very substantive provisions on technical assistance and capacity building, not just a high level provision that we will do that. Or you might need to think of very strong provisions that meaningfully provide for some kind of special and differential treatment among different countries at different stages of digital development. And we haven't seen that yet. Neither in the plurilateral negotiations at the WTO, nor even in like agreements such as the CPTPP, which involve again a variety of countries, and also not in any of the DEAs. Although there are bright rays of hope, right? You have a provision on digital inclusion that opens up doors to do many things. And a lot of the richer countries are now open to signing like more informal things like MOUs on the side of more formal treaties, agreeing to do certain things, agreeing to exchange knowledge or share certain capacity building with other countries. But the question is how much these informal mechanisms can really replace the lack of trust sometimes between richer and less rich countries. I'm not so sure. I'm a bit skeptical, but one should be positive, I guess, as well while looking at these instruments.
Yeah, but in principle, you would think that the capacity to do things like capacity building and is greater in a way in this kind of modular kind of approach. I mean, in the trade world, often you end up with having to make like special exceptions for special and differential treatment, and saying, okay, countries can ramp up their commitments over time, but we're giving them. But here you're like baking it in from the front end. There's a question from Judith Hellerstein. Judith, go ahead.
Yes, hi, it's Judith Hellerstein. So I wanted to also pick up what Stephanie was saying and others, is that especially with the Pacific Island countries, I think it's really important to work with the Pacific Island Forum, because that is really where the countries are working on. And I was working with there was a Pacific ICT ministerial that New Zealand and Australia were part of, and that is a lot of their focus on digital economy. That's one of the main focuses, and especially if you want to get a lot of countries on board in the Pacific, you should really be working closely with the Pacific Island Forum or other countries, because that is where a lot of the Pacific countries can get alignment with them. A lot of them do, especially with the Pacific ICT Ministerial, which was led by Papua New Guinea, but is going to be next hosted by New Caledonia, is that they are working closely with the Pacific Island Forum, and in bringing everyone together. And so I think that these regional groups could be where the capacity building is done, as well as with the Asia Pacific telecommunity. But I would say if you wanted to do trade agreements, work with these little Pacific Island Forum or other related ones to get the capacity building, to get everyone and get buy-in, because without the buy-in, you're not going to get that.
Agreed. I think it's a very good point, Judith, and regionalization is certainly a major part of the trajectory we seem to be on. Anybody want to reply to that point?
I guess the provisions on digital inclusion, which allow for that kind of stakeholder engagement in some of these agreements, could be a starting point for the proposal that Judith put forward.
Yeah.
And just to add, there's actually a trade agreement between Australia, New Zealand, and a number of Pacific Island Forum countries, which is called PACER Plus, which does have some provisions that in particular look at digital trade enablement. So the sort of the paperless trade and kind of using digital technologies, pardon me, to enhance goods trade, which I think, you know, has a lot of promise for Pacific Island nations that can leverage digital technologies essentially to get more value out of the goods exporting that they're doing. But, you know, there's such a body of work that needs to be done to enable digitally delivered services for those economies, but even just building some of the basic digital regulations, you know, domestically that they need around cybersecurity, for example, or online consumer protection. Not sort of particularly glamorous work, but absolutely fundamental to ensuring that those economies are able to participate in a sort of a safe and trusted and enabling way in a more global digital economy.
Thanks. I think that's absolutely right. We had a question in the chat for Fabrice asking how digital economy agreements might contribute to environmental safety, which I think also ties back into the kind of flexibility of these frameworks and the ability to tackle new kinds of issues that in a narrow traditional trade approach become a bit more challenging. Anybody have any thoughts on the environment side, what's possible there? Anybody been looking at the environmental aspect, or?
Well, sorry to keep monopolizing the conversation.
No,
just to chip in, I mean, I think there's a very interesting thread of sort of thinking and policy development and business development that's happening at the moment, which is how to leverage digital technologies to achieve good or better environmental outcomes and greater sustainability, you know, ranging across things like using technology for verifiable ESG credentials or, you know, sustainability, using digitally delivered services for environmental outcomes, so sort of environmental services, to use the technical sort of trade jargon. And I think, you know, there's a very clear potential for technology to deliver good environmental outcomes through greater innovation. And so I suppose in that sense, something that these new agreements or new style of trade rules will enable is being able to realize the potential of digital technologies for those environmental outcomes. But I think it's fair to say that none of these agreements to date have had a specific sort of environment module or provision or a dedicated element. It's really more digital technologies as an enabler of those outcomes rather than a specific a specific aspect of digitalization as such.
But you can certainly see a possibility with this modular approach that if indeed the members wanted to evolve towards addressing environmental stuff, this kind of framework provides a kind of like non-threatening way to get into those more difficult issues. So I think the point is that the approach could be highly relevant. There's a question for David Allen. David, go ahead.
As really fundamentally an outsider observing, I have to first of all notice that this has been fascinating look, I think vital look really, at what might be called the dynamics of international organizing. You might say how the process of evolution, we're able to look inside and see how there's movement from rivulets into, we'll see where this goes, into something more mainstream. If I could ask, and actually building on the very last point that's on the table here, building up a little bit, an outsider looking at this notices one fundamental, that trade agreements on the one side have been about free trade, and on the other hand, free trade has been used as a mechanism for those who are large and dominant to increase their dominance and take advantage of those who aren't so strong. Looking at the process, DEAs and so forth that you have described here, there is the suggestion that at least the smaller economies are finding ways to promote coherence, is the word that was used at the beginning. There's no doubt that the power dynamics in which the big and the powerful try to take advantage of such things will continue. But despite that, environment has come up here. There's been the suggestion throughout the discussion that other factors besides just increasing one's take of the potential out there, other factors such as the environment, such as the word inclusion's been used and not in the sense that it's sometimes used. Here in the US, there is a large push right now for social responsibility by businesses, which is almost shocking. I got a notice from the dean of the Harvard Business School that this is what the school is going to be looking at, the social impact, not just the money-making impact. I'm curious whether or not those of you in the middle of this see there's some possibility there'll be a widening of objectives as this evolutionary process goes forward. Sorry for a bit of length there.
No, it's a good question, David. I appreciate it. And of course, we're all outsiders at some level, unless we're trade negotiators. So please, anybody have thoughts in response to that? And then we have one more question that was asked in the chat that I'll throw out to you, and then we'll conclude. Anybody have a handle on how to address David's points there? Shall I let that linger, and then we'll see if we can wrap into the other last question from Dennis said, what's the best way to monitor outcomes of agreements? Any special sources follow individual agreement arrangements and trends? How to monitor outcomes and track what progress is really being made. So either of those two kinds of things maybe is to wrap into a concluding thought, and then we'll wrap up for today. Yes, Marta, go ahead.
On the last question, I don't necessarily know if maybe it's not necessarily about how to monitor sort of the outcomes, because maybe we are at a stage where some of these agreements are really new, so we don't have yet proper impact assessments, to my knowledge. Then, of course, correct me if I'm wrong. But some of these agreements have entered into force like this year or last year or a couple of years ago. So we still need to see exactly the outcome of this. But I've noticed, for example, there has been a study, a relatively recent study, about trying to assess the readiness, DEA readiness of countries, maybe to sign these sort of DEAs. And I think that this links a little bit probably to the discussion that we were having before about how to engage countries at different levels of development from those that have been the pioneers in developing DEAs and DIPA, for example. So I think that probably at the moment we may need to adapt previous instruments. Maybe economists have a better view on this and can discuss more on this, but I think we can maybe use similar instruments about impact assessments, again, to figure out sort of outcomes of the negotiations of this agreement. But at the same time, we also have some scholars have already attempted at least to figure out how ready countries are, how much policy alignment there can be across different modules. This is what they have tried to do. And I think that this is the interesting new approach that probably, with respect to maybe traditional assessment of these agreements, ex post and ex ante, probably assessing module by module would allow maybe to understand sort of maybe whether some countries would be better off tackling sort of modules as opposed to others. With the question about sort of taking into consideration potential, other issues, my only point would be that the having agreements like DEAs and DIPA has done one thing, which is to basically de-link issues. So we're focusing on certain issues, and that will be, so the negotiations will only be on digital trade. We don't really tackle other issues. But I think that's something that has emerged from the discussion for sure, is that when we discuss now digital trade in general, and especially some of the newest topics like AI, we're definitely not remaining in the realm of trade. If we talk about AI, I mean, ethical principles related to AI governance, that is something that will touch upon that. I mean, it was, we were discussing before about even labor, potential effects on labor of certain technologies, and AI is the one that is most likely going to have job displacement effect that raise a lot of concerns about labor as well. So maybe I haven't necessarily addressed your question fully, but I think that this is something that we may need to consider.
Thank you, Martha. I think actually that was helpful and responsive. Stephanie, do you have something? So just to wrap up, we're moving to the end of the period. So just Stephanie and Rick, if I just get quick things from you guys, drawing on.
Okay.
Can I go first, because I gotta drop off here.
Sure,
so
go ahead.
Last thought here is that I would watch regulatory cooperation in this space. The real issue in many of these modules is what the regulatory approaches are going to be, how consistent, how faithful to the principles they will be. And if one is interested in monitoring things, it's not going to be sufficient just to sort of do an analysis of what the elements of the agreements themselves say and how well they match up or don't. We're really going to be entering into a phase where we need to take a look at much more robust regulatory dialogue and cooperation. And I think this is actually a very good area for research. I mean, I think we've got a number of academics, including you on the line today, Bill, and that would do a great service to the entire field. It would add a level of, dare I say, transparency to all of this process. And so I would watch that as a very important element of the development of this field. And many thanks for inviting me on the webinar. I've got to drop off. Best regards to everyone, including particularly you, Bill. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thanks much, Rick. Stephanie, a closing thought, and then I'll
just very quickly to say that one study or a couple of studies that have been done, really interesting, by Kati Suominen for CSIS, have looked at what is the impact of the digital provisions of CPTPP, which is sort of the foundation for a lot of these DEAs. Definitely worth looking that out. but also to say on the broader sort of impacts, the members of the Inclusive Trade Action Group, which is New Zealand, Canada, and Chile, have recently done an assessment of the CPTPP, including the digital provisions. What does that mean from a sort of progressive trade policy lens? So for women, for small businesses, for Indigenous communities. So also worth having a look at that, trying to unpick some of the sort of more civil society inclusion aspects of and sort of rights-based aspects of these agreements as well. So just to flag that is something that people are starting to think about.
Great. Thank you very much. We're running over, so I'm going to cut it here. Really appreciate everybody's participation. Thought it was a very interesting conversation on an important topic. We will carry the conversation forward into the IGF meeting in Kyoto and look at how these things could be related to fragmentation. That's on October 8th, day 0 of the IGF, if anyone wants to join us. My thanks to Jason Buckwheats, the Executive Director of CITI, for making this happen. And our next meeting will be November 15th. You won't remember that date from now, but you'll get an announcement when we are doing our next session, and hopefully we'll see you all again there too, or some future event. Thanks, everybody, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.